The lung cancer took me slowly. First it was just a cough that wouldn't go away. Then the fatigue. Then the weight loss. Then the pain, deep in my chest, like something was pressing against my ribs from the inside, pushing until I couldn't breathe without wincing. I'd been a smoker for 20 years. Secondhand, mostly. Howard smoked in the bedroom every night, leaning against the headboard with his eyes half closed, blowing smoke at the ceiling like he was trying to reach something up there. I'd asked him to stop. I'd begged him to stop. I'd opened windows and bought air purifiers and left magazines open to articles about lung cancer on his nightstand. He never stopped. So I got lung cancer. And Howard sat by my hospital bed for the last 3 months, holding my hand, looking at me with what I thought was grief. What I thought was love. He was good at that, Howard. Looking like he cared. On my last day, I was too weak to speak. My throat was dry, my lips were cracked, and every breath felt like inhaling broken glass. The morphine helped a little. Just enough to make the edges of the pain blur into something almost bearable. I closed my eyes. And I didn't wake up. But I didn't disappear either. I was still there. Still in the room. Still watching. I just wasn't in my body anymore. I floated near the ceiling, a weightless thing made of nothing but awareness, looking down at my own face on the hospital pillow. Grey. Sunken. The skin stretched too thin over my cheekbones. I barely recognized myself. Howard was still holding my hand. Or at least, he was still holding the hand of the body I used to inhabit. Then he let go. He stood up from the chair he'd been occupying for the last 3 months, and his shoulders straightened like a weight had been lifted off them. He walked to the door of the hospital room and opened it. Stacey was standing there. My best friend since childhood. The woman I'd known longer than I'd known anyone. The one who'd been by my side through everything. Through my wedding, through the miscarriage, through the years when I thought Howard and I were building a life together. She walked in, and she walked straight into Howard's arms. He wrapped them around her, his face pressing into her hair, and I heard the sound he made, a sound I'd never heard him make before. It wasn't grief. It wasn't sadness. It was relief. Like he'd been holding his breath for 20 years and could finally let it out. Stacey, he said. His voice was thick. Stacey, she's gone. I know, she whispered. I know, Howard. I'm here. They held each other for a long time. Minutes. Hours, maybe. Time didn't move the same way when you didn't have a body to measure it with. Then Stacey pulled back just enough to look at him. From now on, she said, I'll take her place. I'll be here for you. I'll give you children. You don't have to take her place, Howard said. He cupped her face in his hands, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen there before, not when he looked at me. Never when he looked at me. Stacey, he said. It was always you. It was always only you. Her face crumpled. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she laughed through them, a wet, broken, relieved laugh. I thought I'd lost you, she said. When she got sick, I thought I'd never get to tell you. I know, he said. I know. I've loved you every single day. Every single day, Stacey. And now we can finally be together. Finally, he agreed. They kissed. Right there. Right in my hospital room. Right next to the bed where my body was still warm, still wearing the hospital gown I'd died in. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tear them apart. I wanted to crash into them like a hurricane and send them flying in opposite directions. I wanted to shake Howard by the shoulders and say what? What could I possibly say that would make a difference? He'd already said it all. It was always you. Always only you. Every single day. Every single day of our 20-year marriage, Howard had been in love with Stacey. Not me. Never me. I floated there, watching them hold each other, watching them whisper reassurances into each other's ears, and I felt something crack open inside me. Something that had been sealed shut for a long, long time. I started to remember things. The miscarriage. I'd been pregnant once. Just once. Howard and I had been married for 3 years, and I'd been so happy when I found out. I'd spent weeks planning the nursery, reading baby books, imagining what our child would look like, his eyes? My nose? A combination of both. Stacey had come over one afternoon with a special tea she'd bought from a health store. She said it would help with the morning sickness. She said it was full of natural herbs that pregnant women had been drinking for centuries. She said it was completely safe. I drank it. The bleeding started 2 hours later. The hospital said it was a miscarriage. Sometimes these things just happen, the doctor told me, patting my hand. It's no one's fault. But it was someone's fault. I knew that now. I knew it the way you know something in your bones. Stacey had given me something that made me lose that baby. Something that made me lose my only chance at being a mother. Howard had been there when it happened. He'd driven me to the hospital. He'd held my hand. He'd told me it would be okay. And later that same night, I'd overheard him on the phone, whispering, "She's fine. It worked. She'll never know." I hadn't understood what he meant back then. I'd convinced myself I'd imagined it. I'd convinced myself that the stress of the miscarriage had made me paranoid. But now I knew. He was talking to Stacey. He was telling her the plan had worked. The plan to make sure I never had children. Because if I had children, I might not be so easy to leave. If I had children, Howard might have felt guilty. If I had children, the perfect little life they'd built together, the one where he was my husband in public and her lover in secret, might have been threatened. So they got rid of the baby. And I never got pregnant again. Howard never touched me after that. Not really. He'd come to bed late and leave early. He'd find excuses to sleep in the guest room. He'd avoid my touch like I was made of something contagious. I thought it was grief. I thought he was just as broken by the miscarriage as I was. But he wasn't grieving. He was just waiting. Waiting for me to die so he could finally be with the woman he'd always loved. And then there was Ethan. Ethan was Stacey's husband. He was a professor at the local university. Quiet, brilliant, soft-spoken, with eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses that always seemed to be looking at something far away. He'd been married to Stacey for just as long as I'd been married to Howard. He died 2 years before I did. Stomach cancer. The day of his funeral, Stacey didn't cry. She didn't even look sad. She stood at the graveside with her face perfectly composed, accepting condolences like she was accepting a business card at a networking event. Howard was the one who was devastated. He'd shown up at the funeral with red-rimmed eyes. He'd spent the whole service with his arm around Stacey's shoulders. He'd organized the food and the flowers and the memorial service, and he'd told me, "She's alone now, Renee. We need to look after her. She's going to need us." I'd agreed. Of course I'd agreed. Stacey was my best friend. If she needed support, I was going to be there. I remember one night, a few weeks after the funeral. Stacey had come over to our house, and she'd been sitting on the couch, staring at the floor with blank eyes. "Renee," she'd said, "I want to tell you something." "What?" "I never loved him. Ethan. I never loved him at all." I'd been stunned. "Stacey, he was your husband." "I know. But I married him for the wrong reasons. He was stable. He was safe. He was," she'd shaken her head. "He wasn't Howard." "You mean? Don't you ever look at Howard and feel like he's too good for you? Like you don't deserve him?" I hadn't known how to answer that. Because yes, sometimes I did feel that way. Howard was handsome and strong and capable. He fixed things around the house and remembered my birthday and made me feel safe. Of course I felt like I didn't deserve him. But Stacey was sitting on my couch, in my living room, telling me she'd never loved her husband because she was too busy loving mine. And I'd been so stupid. So willfully, intentionally, determinedly stupid. "I understand," I'd said. I'd wrapped my arms around her. "You're part of this family, Stacey. We're not going anywhere. If you need Howard, you can borrow him whenever you want. He's your brother now. We're all family." I said that. I actually said that. I remembered the look on Howard's face when he heard me. The way he'd dropped the fork he was holding. The way it had clattered onto the plate and spilled food across the table. I'd thought it was because he was moved by my generosity. Now I knew it was because he couldn't believe his luck. I'd just handed him permission. I'd just given him the green light to do exactly what he'd been doing behind my back for years. And Stacey had looked at him over my shoulder with a smile that said everything. She'll never know. She'd been right. I'd never known. Until now. The memories kept coming. All the little things I'd ignored. All the signs I'd refused to see. The way Howard's hand always found Stacey's waist when they stood next to each other. The way he'd look at her when he thought I wasn't watching. The way she'd wear perfume that smelled exactly like the one he'd bought me for our anniversary. Only she'd started wearing it a week before, and I'd wondered why he'd seemed disappointed when I put it on. The way they'd disappear together at parties and come back with slightly flushed faces and slightly disheveled clothes. The way Ethan had looked when he was dying. The way he'd looked at Stacey, and the way she'd looked at him, and the way I'd been so certain it was love when it was really just, what? Obligation. Duty. A lack of better options. Ethan had been like me. A placeholder. The person who was there because the person they really wanted couldn't be. He'd died alone, surrounded by people who didn't actually love him. Just like me. I thought about the last conversation I'd had with him, a few weeks before he died. He'd been so thin, so tired, so quiet. Stacey had asked me to visit him because she was too upset to be there. She'd sent me to sit by his bedside and hold his hand so she didn't have to. "I'm sorry," he'd said to me. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry for everything." "What do you mean?" I'd asked. "I mean," he'd coughed, a terrible wet sound that made my stomach clench. "I mean you deserve better. You always did." I'd thought he was delirious. I'd patted his hand and told him to rest. Now I understood. He'd known. He'd known about Stacey and Howard, and he'd wanted to warn me, but he hadn't had the strength. Or maybe he'd been too ashamed to say it out loud. Either way, he'd died the same way I did, surrounded by people who were waiting for him to be gone. All of this crashed through me in waves. The memory of Ethan, dying in a hospital room while Stacey was somewhere else, probably with Howard. The memory of my miscarriage, the blood, the pain, the doctor's cold hands and colder words. Sometimes these things just happen. The memory of Howard's face, that night, when he'd said she's fine. It worked. The memory of Stacey, sitting on my couch, telling me she'd never loved her husband because she was in love with mine. And the memory of my own body, finally failing, finally giving up, finally surrendering to the cancer that Howard had fed me one cigarette at a time. I felt something shift in the space where my heart used to be. It wasn't grief. I'd already grieved. I'd grieved for the baby, for the marriage, for the years I'd wasted, for the life I'd never get back. There was nothing left to grieve. It wasn't even anger. Anger had burned itself out somewhere between the first glimpse of Howard's face and the last echo of his whispered confession. It was something colder. Something harder. Something that didn't have a name in any language I knew. It was the certainty that I had been used. Used up. Drained dry. And then thrown away. 20 years. 20 years of my life. 20 years of cooking his meals, cleaning his house, being his wife, being his, what? His beard. His cover. His alibi. 20 years of waiting for him to love me. And he'd never loved me. Not once. Not for a single second. He'd loved Stacey. He'd always loved Stacey. And Stacey had loved him. And they'd just been waiting. Waiting for Ethan to die. Waiting for me to die. Waiting for the obstacles to be removed so they could finally be together. I looked down at my own dead face on the hospital bed. I looked at Howard, who was still holding Stacey in his arms. I looked at the doorway, where a nurse was standing with a clipboard, waiting for them to finish so she could come in and do whatever needed to be done with my body. And I made a decision. I wasn't going to let this happen again. I didn't know how, I didn't even know if it was possible, but I wasn't going to let them win. Not again. Not ever again. I reached for something. Something inside me. Something that felt like it had been there all along, waiting for this moment. I reached for time itself. And I fell. I fell through darkness. Through cold. Through nothing. Through years and years of my own life, playing backward like a film reel running in reverse. I saw Howard's face the day we got married. The way he smiled, but his eyes were somewhere else. Looking past me. Looking for her. I saw Stacey's face at the wedding. The way she'd clapped and cheered and thrown rice, and the way she'd looked at Howard when she thought no one was watching. I saw Ethan's face in his hospital bed. The way his eyes had found mine at the end. The way he'd whispered, "You deserve better." I saw my own face in 1,000 mirrors, 1,000 moments, 1,000 mornings when I'd woken up next to Howard and I thought he loved me. And then I landed. I landed hard, like I'd been dropped from a great height. And when I opened my eyes, I was back. The room was small. Warm. The air smelled like coffee and the slightly burnt scent of a too-hot radiator. A lamp with a green glass shade cast a dim amber glow across a table where 4 cups of coffee were waiting. I blinked. I looked down at myself. My hands were young again. No veins, no spots, no thin papery skin that bruised at the slightest touch. My fingers weren't curled with arthritis. My nails weren't yellowed. I was wearing a white blouse and a cardigan. The kind of thing I'd worn in my 20s, when I still had hope. I was young again. I was 21 again. I was in a coffee shop, sitting at a table with 3 other people. Across from me, Howard was 21, too. He was broad-shouldered and handsome, with the kind of rugged good looks that made girls turn their heads. He was looking at someone on the other side of the table, not at me, never at me, with an expression I recognized. That hungry, focused expression he used to get when he was looking at something he wanted. The person he was looking at was Stacey. She was 21. Beautiful. Blonde. Laughing at something the 4th person at the table had just said. The 4th person was Ethan. He was young, too. Duck-head. Quiet. He was wearing wire-rimmed glasses that made him look like he'd just stepped out of a poetry seminar, and he had a way of smiling that made you feel like he was sharing a secret with you. This was the night. The night of the double date. The night when everything had started. This was the night when Stacey had decided she wanted Ethan, because he was safe, because he was kind, because he was the kind of man who would never hurt her. And Howard had decided he wanted Stacey, because he always had. And I had been left with Howard because I hadn't known any better, and because no one else had chosen me. But I knew better now. And this time, I was going to choose for myself. I looked around the table. Howard was saying something to Stacey. I didn't hear what. I didn't care. Stacey was laughing. She had that bright, musical laugh that made everyone in the room turn to look at her. She was wearing a red top that showed off her figure, and she was leaning forward, playing with her hair, doing all the things she'd always done to make sure everyone's eyes were on her. Ethan was looking at her, too. But his eyes didn't have that hungry look. They were just curious. Polite. The way you look at a stranger in a coffee shop when you're trying to make conversation. And I sat there, watching all of them, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. I wasn't dead anymore. I wasn't dying anymore. I wasn't the woman who'd been lied to and used and thrown away. I was young. I was strong. I had a second chance. And I knew exactly what I was going to do. I reached across the table and took Ethan's hand. He looked up, startled. His glasses were slightly askew, and his eyes were a deep, warm brown behind the lenses. Ethan, I said. My voice was steadier than I expected. I like you. I really like you. Would you like to go for a walk with me? He blinked. For a moment, he just stared at me, like I'd spoken to him in a language he didn't understand. Then his expression shifted. Just a little. The corner of his mouth curved up. Funny, he said softly. I was about to ask you the same thing. Howard's head snapped toward us, his face a mask of sudden tension. Stacey's smile had frozen on her face. But I wasn't looking at them. I was looking at Ethan. And somewhere in the space between our hands, I felt something shift. Something that told me I wasn't the only one who'd come back. Let's go, he said. He stood up. He took my hand, not lightly, not casually. He took it like he'd been holding it for years, like he'd been waiting for this moment his whole life. He took my hand like he was never going to let go. And I realized, just for a second, that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the only one who'd been lied to. Maybe Ethan had seen the truth, too. Maybe this wasn't just my second chance. Maybe it was ours. We walked out of the coffee shop together, leaving Howard and Stacey behind. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. They didn't matter anymore. Not to me. Not now. I had a second chance. I had someone who looked at me like I was the only person in the room. I had a future I could choose for myself. And I was going to make sure that this time, I got it right. Ethan held my hand as we walked out of the coffee shop, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Safe. It was strange, feeling safe with someone I barely knew. In my past life, I'd spent 20 years thinking I was safe with Howard, and I'd been wrong. But this felt different. This felt like coming home. He led me down the street, past the shop windows and the streetlights, until we reached a small park at the end of the block. There was a bench under a tree, and he sat down, pulling me gently down beside him. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he turned to me, his eyes serious behind his glasses. "So," he said quietly, "what year is it for you?" My heart stopped. I stared at him. "What?" "I'm asking," he said, "because I remember. I remember everything. I remember being sick. I remember dying. I remember," he paused, swallowing hard. "I remember watching my wife and your husband, and knowing that I'd wasted my entire life on someone who never loved me." His voice broke on the last words. I reached for his hand, squeezing it tight. "Same," I said. "I remember the same thing." He let out a long breath, his shoulders sagging with relief. "I was hoping you'd say that," he said. "I was so afraid you wouldn't." He smiled then. It was a small smile, tired and sad, but also warm. "I died in 2018, he said. "Stomach cancer. Do you remember?" I nodded. "I remember. I came to visit you. You told me I deserved better. I didn't understand then. I knew you didn't understand. But I couldn't tell you the truth. I was too ashamed." "Don't be ashamed," I said. "I didn't see it either. I was just as blind." We sat in silence for a while, holding hands, watching the streetlights flicker on as the sun went down. "It was Stacey," I said finally. "It was always Stacey. For 20 years, Howard was in love with her. She was in love with him. And I was just convenient," Ethan finished. "Same with me. I was convenient. I was a good provider. I made her look like a respectable married woman. But I was never the one she wanted." He turned to look at me. "She got pregnant once," he said. "Stacey. I didn't know who the father was. She told me it was mine. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to be a father so badly. But then she lost the baby, or said she did. I don't know what really happened." He shook his head. "Looking back, I think she might have gotten rid of it on purpose. She didn't want a child with me. She wanted a child with Howard. The baby that I thought was ours was probably his." I gripped his hand tighter. "She did the same thing to me," I said. "She gave me something, some tea, she said it was for morning sickness, and I lost my baby. I never got pregnant again. I think she made sure I couldn't." Ethan closed his eyes, breathing deeply. "They destroyed us," he said. "Both of us. They used us and they threw us away." "I know. So what do we do now?" I turned to face him fully. In the dim light, his face was pale and thin, but his eyes were sharp. Intelligent. Watching me like he was waiting for an answer. "We live," I said. "We live, and we don't let them win." He smiled at that, a real smile, not the sad little grimace he'd been wearing all evening. "Together?" he asked. "Together," I agreed. That night, I walked home with my head spinning. I was young again, 21, not 45. I had my whole life ahead of me, and I wasn't going to waste it on Howard. I wasn't going to waste it on anyone who didn't love me back. I walked into my parents' house, the house I'd lived in before I married Howard, and the familiar smell of dinner hit me. My mother was in the kitchen, humming. My father was in his armchair, reading the paper. Renee, my mother called. How was the double date? Did you meet anyone nice? I opened my mouth to answer, but I didn't know what to say. The truth was too complicated. The truth was that I'd just agreed to build a life with a man I'd met hours ago. A man I'd loved, in a way, for years, without ever knowing it. We had a nice time, I said. There was someone there. Ethan. He was very kind. My mother beamed. A nice man. That's wonderful, honey. Did you like him? Yes, I said honestly. I really liked him. But Stacey wasn't going to make it easy. She showed up at my parents' house 2 days later, red-faced and furious. She stormed into my room without knocking, her hands on her hips, her eyes blazing. Renee. What was that? I looked up from the book I was reading, a study guide for the SAT, which I was planning to retake. I'd never gone to college in my past life. I'd married Howard instead. But this time, I was going to make something of myself. What was what? I asked calmly. You know what I'm talking about. At the coffee shop. You stole Ethan right out from under me. I didn't say anything. I just set down my book and looked at her. You stole him. Is that what you think? I asked. I didn't know you had any claim on him, Stacey. You'd only just met. So what? You knew I liked him. I told you I liked him before the date. Actually, I said quietly, you said you were curious about him. You said you wanted to see what he was like. You didn't say you were in love with him. Renee. You know what I meant. I don't think I do, I said. I don't think I know what you mean at all, Stacey. Maybe you should tell me. Her face reddened. Her fists clenched at her sides. You're my best friend, she said. You're supposed to help me. You're supposed to be on my side. I'm on your side, I said. That's why I'm telling you the truth. I like Ethan. I want to be with him. If you like him too, you should have said something before the date. You didn't. So don't blame me. She stared at me like she didn't recognize me. You've changed, she said. You're different. I'm exactly the same, I said. I just stopped pretending. She stormed out. I sat there for a long time, staring at the door she'd slammed behind her. In my past life, I would have chased after her. I would have apologized for something that wasn't my fault. I would have let her guilt me into giving up what I wanted. Not this time. This time, I was going to fight for myself. Ethan found me in the college library 2 weeks later. I was sitting at a table with a pile of books in front of me, studying for the entrance exam. I hadn't been in a classroom in 20 years, but the knowledge was coming back. Slowly. In pieces. Like finding scattered puzzle pieces and putting them back together. Studying hard? He asked, sliding into the seat across from me. I smiled at him. Trying to. He set a coffee cup in front of me. For you. I'm learning to make it. It's not very good yet, but I'm practicing. I laughed. Ethan, you're not supposed to practice making coffee on me. It's part of my charm, he said. I'm very poorly trained in domestic skills, but I'm willing to learn. I took a sip. It was terrible. Burnt and bitter and too strong. It's perfect, I said. He smiled. It was a shy smile, uncertain, like he was still afraid that I was a dream he'd wake up from. I'm glad you're here, he said. I've been thinking about you. I've been thinking about you, too. He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes searching my face. Is this real? He asked. I think so. Because I keep waiting to wake up, he said. I keep waiting to be sick again. I keep waiting to die. And every morning I wake up and I'm still here, and it feels like a miracle. It is a miracle, I said. We were given a second chance. A real one. We don't have to waste it. He reached across the table and took my hand. I'm not going to waste it, he said. I promise you that. I'm going to live every day like it might be my last. That sounds exhausting. Maybe, he said. But I've already had all the rest I need. That evening, he walked me home. We passed by the coffee shop where we'd met, and I felt a strange pull toward it. Like a magnet drawing me back to the place where everything had changed. Do you want to stop? Ethan asked. No, I said. I don't want to go back there. I want to go forward. That's all I've ever wanted. To go forward. We walked past the coffee shop, past the park where we'd sat and talked, past all the places that were part of our old lives. I thought about Howard. About Stacey. About the 20 years I'd wasted on two people who'd never loved me. And I thought about Ethan. About the way he'd looked at me. The way he'd held my hand. The way he was walking beside me now, matching my steps, staying by my side. He wasn't going to leave me. Not this time. Not ever. I had found someone who would stay. Someone who would fight for me. Someone who would tell me the truth, no matter how hard it was. And I was going to do the same for him. So what's the plan? Ethan asked as we reached the door of my house. How are we going to do this? I thought about it. I'm going to go to college, I said. I'm going to study hard. I'm going to get a job, a career, something that makes me proud. And I'm going to marry you, and we're going to have a life that they can't touch. He leaned in and kissed me, a brief touch of lips, soft and warm and tentative. Good plan, he said. I'll do the same. That's the plan, I said. We'll be happy. It was a simple plan, really. Just survive. Just thrive. Just build something that would last. And that was exactly what I was going to do. A few days later, I bumped into Howard at the grocery store. He was standing in front of the milk section, looking uncomfortable, and he didn't see me until I was right next to him. Renee, he said, clearly startled. Hey, I've been meaning to call you. I smiled. It was the same smile I'd used for years, pleasant and polite and utterly unreadable. Hi, Howard. How have you been? Fine, he said. Good, actually. Look, Renee, I want to talk to you about what happened. At the double date. I know you and Ethan hit it off, and you hit it off with Stacey, I said. I saw you too. You didn't exactly hide it. He reddened. I don't know what you mean. It's okay, Howard. You don't have to pretend. I don't care. I didn't care. It was true. He could have Stacey. He could have anyone he wanted. He was nothing to me. You don't care, he repeated, looking confused. But I thought. You thought what? That I'd be jealous. That I'd want you back. Well, I mean. Listen, I said. I don't want you. I don't love you. I don't even like you. You and Stacey are perfect for each other, and I hope you'll be very happy together. I smiled again, and this time I made sure he could see it was a lie. A pleasant, polite, utterly cold smile. Have a nice life, I said. I won't be in it. I walked away, leaving him standing there in front of the milk. That night, I told my parents I was going to marry Ethan. They were surprised, but they were also happy. He seems like a very nice young man, my mother said. He's studying to be a professor. A real professor. He'll be a good husband, my father said. He'll take care of you. I'm going to take care of myself, I said. My mother looked at me strangely. What do you mean? I mean I'm going to college, I said. I'm going to have a career. I don't need anyone to take care of me. Of course not, honey, my mother said, patting my hand. But it's nice to have someone who wants to. She didn't understand. She'd been born in a different generation, a different world. She didn't know what it was like to be trapped in a life you'd never chosen. But I knew. And I wasn't going to let that happen to me again. The wedding was small and simple. Ethan's mother gave me her grandmother's ring, an antique emerald set in gold. We don't have much, she said. But this ring is precious. It's been in the family for generations. I want you to have it. I looked at the ring. It was beautiful. Green and gold and full of history. And I thought about the other ring. The one I'd worn in my first life, the one Howard had put on my finger with a smile that meant nothing. I'd worn that ring for 20 years, and all it had been was a lie. This ring was real. This ring was something true. I let Ethan's mother put it on my finger. Thank you, I said. I'll take care of it. Take care of him, she said, nodding toward Ethan. That's all I ask. The wedding night was quiet and peaceful. Ethan was nervous in a way that made me smile. He kept fidgeting with his glasses, and he'd already apologized 3 times for things that didn't matter. You don't have to be nervous, I said. I'm not going anywhere. I know, he said. I just keep waiting for something to go wrong. Waiting for it all to disappear. It's not going to disappear. He looked at me, his eyes serious. Will you stay? He asked. Will you really stay? I reached for him, pulling him close. I'll stay, I said. For as long as you want me to. He closed his eyes and rested his forehead against mine. That's all I need, he said. That's everything. The years that followed were kind to us. I studied hard and got into a good university. I studied computer science, the same field Ethan was studying. Together, we were building a future. We were going to be part of the tech revolution. We knew it was coming, the rise of the internet, the explosion of social media, the way the world was going to change. We had a head start that almost no one else had, and we were going to use it. Stacey and Howard got married a few months after we did. Their wedding was lavish and expensive, paid for by Stacey's parents. Stacey was glowing with happiness. Howard looked proud. I watched them from across the room and I felt nothing. Nothing at all. They were 2 strangers. 2 people I used to know. 2 people who'd hurt me in ways I would never be able to explain. But they were strangers now, and they couldn't hurt me anymore. So here I was. 21 years old, married to a man who loved me, with a future ahead of me that was full of hope and promise. I was happy. And I knew, deep down, that this time it was real. The first year of our marriage was the happiest I'd ever been. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever is. But it was real. Every morning I woke up next to Ethan, and every morning I felt a small surge of disbelief, that this was my life, that this was my husband, that I had somehow been given a second chance to get it right. We lived in a small apartment near the university. It was cramped and drafty and the pipes made strange noises at night, but it was ours. We painted the walls a soft cream color. We hung pictures we'd bought from thrift stores. We cooked meals together in a kitchen so small we could barely stand side by side. Ethan was finishing his graduate degree, and I was working my way through my undergraduate classes, studying computer science and business. We were building something together. A future. A real one. And in the quiet moments, when we were sitting on the couch with our books spread out around us, I would look at him and feel a wave of gratitude so strong it almost hurt. He was the one who'd encouraged me to go back to school. You're smarter than you give yourself credit for, he'd said when I'd hesitated. You just never had the chance to prove it. He was right. In my past life, I'd been a wife and nothing else. A homemaker. A support system. A placeholder. I'd never had the chance to be anything more. This time, I was going to be everything. My classes were challenging, but I threw myself into them with a determination that surprised everyone, including myself. I stayed up late studying. I went to office hours. I formed study groups with other students. My professors noticed. You have a real aptitude for this, one of them told me. Have you considered pursuing graduate work? I hadn't, not really. But the idea lingered in the back of my mind. Maybe I could be more than I'd ever dreamed. Maybe I could be anything. While I was building my new life, Howard and Stacey were building theirs. They'd gotten married a few months after us, in a lavish ceremony that had been splashed across the local society pages. Stacey's parents had paid for everything, the flowers, the catering, the photographer, the designer dress. I'd seen the photos online. Stacey looked radiant. Howard looked proud. They looked like the perfect couple. And maybe they were. Maybe they'd finally gotten what they'd always wanted, and they were living happily ever after. I didn't care either way. But they weren't happy. Not really. I found this out from my mother, who still kept in touch with Stacey's mother. Small towns, small circles, endless gossip. Did you hear about Stacey? My mother asked one afternoon. She's been having a terrible time of it. Howard lost his job last month. He's been out of work for weeks. Stacey's been frantic. I kept my face neutral. That's too bad. And she's been trying to get pregnant. Poor thing. It's not going well. She's been to see so many doctors, and none of them can figure out what's wrong. I didn't say anything. Because I knew what was wrong. Stacey had spent years poisoning me. The herbal tea she'd given me during my pregnancy hadn't just made me lose that one baby. It had damaged my body so badly that I could never conceive again. She'd done it to keep me from having Howard's child. She'd done it to make sure that when I was gone, there would be no heirs, no complications, no reasons for Howard to stay. She'd destroyed my fertility to secure her own future. And now she was facing the consequences. I didn't feel sorry for her. I felt sorry for myself, for the baby I'd lost, for all the years I'd never get back. But I didn't feel sorry for Stacey. She'd made her bed. Now she was lying in it. Howard came to see me a few weeks later. It was late in the evening, and I was studying for an exam. When I opened the door and saw him standing there, I felt a surge of cold anger. "Renee," he said, "I need to talk to you." I stepped aside to let him in. I didn't want to, but I knew he wouldn't leave until he'd said whatever he'd come to say. He sat down on our small couch, looking around the apartment with an expression I couldn't quite read. Disdain, maybe. Jealousy. The apartment was small and humble, but it was clean, and it was filled with signs of a happy life. Books on the shelves. Photos on the walls. Ethan's jacket draped over the back of a chair. "You're doing well," he said. "I can see that." I'm glad. I always knew you'd do well if you had the chance." I didn't respond. He was lying, and we both knew it. "Howard," I said, "why are you here?" He shifted uncomfortably. "I need to ask you something. Something important." I waited. "Stacey and I," he said. "We've been having some problems. Financial problems, mostly, but also other things." He swallowed. "She's been depressed. Stressed. She wants a baby, and she can't have one, and she's been taking it out on me." "I'm sorry to hear that. Renee, I know we had our differences, I know things ended badly, but I need you to talk to her. You're the only one who can help her. She trusts you." I stared at him. "She trusts me?" "Yes. You're her best friend. Even after everything, she still talks about you." I shook my head slowly, a cold smile forming on my lips. "Howard, do you really think I'm going to help her? After everything she did to me?" "What do you mean?" I laughed. It was a short, bitter sound. "Think about it, Howard. Think about the miscarriage. Think about the tea she gave me. Think about how I never got pregnant again." His face went pale. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about. She made me infertile. She poisoned me. And you knew about it." He stood up abruptly, knocking over a pile of books. "That's not true. That's not, you're lying." "I wish I were lying. But we both know I'm not." He stared at me for a long moment, his face a mask of confusion and fear. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said finally. "I don't know what Stacey did. But if she did something..." "Stop pretending, Howard." I walked to the door and held it open. "You knew. You were part of it. You helped her." "I didn't." "You can leave now." He hesitated, his mouth open, like he was trying to think of something to say. But there was nothing to say. Nothing that would make it better. He walked out, and I closed the door behind him. Ethan came home an hour later. He found me sitting on the couch, staring at the wall. "What happened?" he asked, sitting down beside me. "Howard came to see me," I said. He tensed. "What did he want?" "He wanted me to help Stacey. She's been having a hard time. She can't get pregnant." Ethan was silent for a long moment. "Did you tell him?" "I told him what she did to me. I told him she poisoned me, and he knew about it." "How did he react?" I shrugged. "He denied it. But I could see it in his face. He knew. Ethan reached for my hand, holding it tightly. "I'm sorry you had to see him," he said. "You shouldn't have to deal with them anymore." "I know. We're going to be happy," he said. "That's the best revenge. Just being happy." I nodded, but I wasn't sure I believed it. Weeks passed. I threw myself into my studies, trying to forget the encounter. It worked, mostly. My grades were good. My professors were impressed. I'd even started applying for internships at tech companies, aiming for positions that would set me up for a career after graduation. Ethan's career was taking off, too. He'd been offered a position at the university, a tenure-track professorship in computer science. It was exactly what he'd wanted. We were building the life we'd dreamed of, piece by piece. And then Stacey showed up. She appeared at our apartment on a Saturday morning, wearing dark sunglasses and looking thin and pale under her carefully applied makeup. "Renee," she said, "I need to talk to you." I stood in the doorway, blocking her way. "I don't think there's anything for us to talk about. Please. It's important." "I'm busy, Stacey." "Renee, please. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything. I know I was wrong. I know I hurt you. But I need you to listen to me." Against my better judgment, I stepped aside and let her in. She sat on our couch, looking around at the apartment with the same expression Howard had worn. Disdain. Jealousy. "You've really done well for yourself," she said. "The apartment, the career, she gestured vaguely at the bookshelf. "Everything." "Thank you." "Ethan seems happy," she said. "He never looked like that when he was with me." "I don't want to talk about Ethan." "Okay. I don't blame you. I wanted to say I'm sorry. About everything." I waited. "I know I did terrible things," she continued. "I was jealous. I was always jealous of you. You had everything I wanted, Ethan's attention, your career, your life. And I wanted to take it all away." "You succeeded," I said. "You took everything from me. My marriage, my children, my health. You destroyed me." She flinched. "I know," she said. "I'm sorry. I can't undo it. But I want to try." "You want to try?" "I want to make things right between us. We used to be best friends. We used to love each other. Can't we go back to the way things were?" I looked at her for a long moment. "You gave me a drink that made me lose my baby," I said quietly. "You poisoned me. You made sure I could never have children. And you spent 20 years sleeping with my husband behind my back. And now you want me to forgive you." She was crying. Real tears, or something that looked like them. "I'm so sorry," she repeated. "I was out of control. I know I was. I was so jealous. I didn't know what I was doing." "You knew exactly what you were doing. You planned it. You and Howard." She shook her head, her eyes wide and pleading. "We can't go back to the way things were," I said. "We can never go back. I don't want to be your friend. I don't want to be anything to you. I want you to leave, and I want you to never come back." She stared at me, her mouth open. "Renee, please. I don't have anyone else. Howard and I are having problems, and I need a friend." "Then find someone else. Please. Get out, Stacey. Now." She stood up slowly, her face pale. She looked at me one more time, as if she was waiting for me to change my mind. I didn't. She walked to the door, and she looked back. "Renee. You were always better than me. You were always kind. I wanted to be like you." She swallowed. "But I couldn't. And I hated you for it. Goodbye, Stacey." She left. And this time, I was sure she wouldn't come back. The next few years passed in a blur of work and study and building the life we'd always wanted. I graduated with honors. I got a job at a tech company in the city, working on software development. I was good at it. I loved it. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was doing something meaningful. Ethan was doing well, too. He'd gotten his doctorate and his professorship, and he was respected in his field. We moved into a bigger apartment, then a house. A real house, with a yard and a garden and room for all the things we'd never had. We planted trees in the backyard, and we watched them grow. I looked at my life and I thought, this is it. This is what I was fighting for. And I hadn't even reached the best part yet. We didn't have children. I'd known I wouldn't be able to. The damage that Stacey had done to my body was permanent. But Ethan had never made me feel like I was less because of it. I didn't marry you for your ability to have children, he said. I married you because I love you. We could adopt, I said. Then we'll adopt. Or we won't. Either way, we're happy. He was right. We were happy. And that was more than I'd ever dared to hope for. One night, we were sitting on our back porch, watching the stars come out. Ethan had his arm around my shoulders, and I was leaning against him, feeling the warmth of his body against mine. Are you happy? He asked. Completely, I said. Good. Me too. We sat there in comfortable silence, and I let myself feel it. The joy. The satisfaction. The peace that came from knowing I'd finally done something right. I'd been given a second chance, and I'd taken it. I'd found someone who loved me the way I'd always wanted to be loved. I'd built a life that was worth living. And the people who'd hurt me, they were gone. They couldn't touch me anymore. This was my life now. And it was beautiful. I should have known Howard wouldn't give up that easily. A few weeks after Stacey's visit, he showed up at our house again. This time, he didn't look sorry. He didn't look guilty. He looked determined. He stood on my doorstep with his jaw set and his eyes hard, and I knew before he even opened his mouth that whatever he was about to say wasn't going to be good. Renee, he said. We need to talk. Last time you said that, you asked me to help the woman who poisoned me. I'm not interested in round 2. Just hear me out. No. I started to close the door. He shoved his foot into the gap, stopping it. 5 minutes, he said. That's all I'm asking. I looked at him for a long moment. His face was flushed. His hands were shaking. He looked like a man who had nothing left to lose. Fine, I said. 5 minutes. Then you leave. We sat in my living room. I made sure to stay standing, arms crossed, keeping the distance between us as wide as possible. Howard sat on the edge of the couch, leaning forward, like he was about to deliver some kind of ultimatum. I want you to give Ethan back to Stacey, he said. I blinked. I thought I'd heard him wrong. Excuse me. You heard me. I want you to give Ethan back to Stacey. I stared at him. I waited for him to laugh, to crack a smile, to acknowledge that this was some kind of joke. He didn't. Let me get this straight, I said slowly. You want me to leave my husband? The man I love. The man who's been nothing but kind to me. So your wife can have him back. Stacey never stopped loving him. Then why did she marry you? He flinched. It's complicated. No, it's not. She chose you. You chose her. You've always chosen each other. And now you want to undo it all because it didn't work out the way you wanted. Renee, that night at the coffee shop, Stacey was supposed to end up with Ethan. You knew that. She saw him first. She was interested in him first. You jumped in and took him. So that's what this is about. The double date. You think I stole something that belonged to her? Yes. I felt something snap inside me. Howard, you are so far out of line I don't even know where to start. I didn't steal anyone. Ethan is a person. He has free will. He chose me. He wanted me. He never wanted Stacey, not then, not ever. That's not true. It is true. He told me. He told me everything. About how Stacey made his life a living hell. About how she humiliated him and belittled him and made him feel like he was worthless. About how she stayed married to him not because she loved him, but because she wanted his money and his status. About how, when he was dying in the hospital, she was out with you. Howard's face went pale. She told you that? No, I said. Ethan told me. He stood up abruptly. You're lying. You're making this up. I'm not making anything up. You don't want to hear the truth because it makes you look bad. But the truth is, Stacey never loved Ethan. She used him. Just like she used me. Just like she's using you. His fists clenched at his sides. Take it back. Take what back? The truth. I can't take it back. It's already out there. You're just jealous, he said, his voice rising. That's what this is. You're jealous of what Stacey and I have together. You always were. I laughed. It was a short, bitter sound. Jealous. Of you. Howard, you're a man who married a woman he didn't love and then spent 20 years sleeping with her best friend. You're a pathetic excuse for a husband. You're nothing to me. He looked like I'd slapped him. Renee, he said, and his voice was suddenly soft. Pleading. I know I made mistakes. I know I hurt you. But I'm trying to make things right. I'm trying to be a better person. Then try somewhere else. What's that supposed to mean? It means you should go home to your wife and figure out your own problems. Stop dragging me into them. You think I want to be with Stacey, he said. You think I'm happy with her. I don't care. Renee, I've been thinking about you. About us. About what we could have had. I held up my hand, cutting him off. Let me tell you something, Howard. In another life, I died thinking you loved me. I died thinking I had a husband who cared about me. And when I was gone, you stood over my body and told Stacey that you'd loved her all along. That it had never been me. That I was just, I swallowed, the bile rising in my throat. Just a placeholder. His eyes widened. He looked genuinely shocked. How do you know about? I know everything, I said. I know about the miscarriage. I know about the tea she gave me. I know about the nights you spent with her while I was asleep in the next room. I know about the day you told her you loved her, the day of her husband's funeral, while his body was still in the ground. He stared at me like I'd grown a second head. Renee, he said, his voice shaking. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do. You just don't want to admit it. I walked to the door and held it open. Get out, Howard. Renee. Get out. Now. He hesitated. For a moment, I thought he might try to argue further. But something in my expression must have told him it wasn't worth it. He walked past me, and I slammed the door behind him. I stood there for a long time, my hands shaking. The anger was so intense I could taste it in my mouth. Bitter and metallic. I'd kept it all bottled up for so long. The betrayal. The lies. The years I'd wasted. And now, finally, I'd let it out. It felt good. It also felt terrible. I heard the front door open. Ethan walked in, carrying a bag of groceries. He stopped when he saw me standing in the hallway, my face white and my hands trembling. What happened? He asked, setting the bag down. Howard was here. The name made him go still. What did he want? He wanted me to leave you. So Stacey could have you back. Ethan's expression shifted. The softness vanished, replaced by something harder. I'd never seen him look like that before. What did you say? I told him no. I told him the truth, about everything. About the miscarriage. About Stacey. About what they did to us. He crossed the room and pulled me into his arms. I'm sorry you had to go through that, he said. I should have been here. I'm fine. I handled it. I know you did. You're strong. He pulled back and looked at me, his eyes searching my face. Is there anything you want to tell me? I thought about it. About the years I'd spent keeping secrets. About the way I'd let people walk all over me without ever speaking up. Yes, I said. There is. We sat in the living room, facing each other. Ethan was quiet. He'd known something was coming, I could see it in his eyes. He just didn't know what. I was there, I said. When you died. He went very still. In your first life, I continued. You were in the hospital. I came to visit you. You were so thin, so pale. You looked like you were already gone, even though your heart was still beating. I remember, he said. I remember you were there. You held my hand. Yes. You told me I deserved better. I didn't know what you meant then. I meant everything. And then I died too, I said. And I saw Howard and Stacey together. I saw them holding each other and talking about how they'd finally be together. And I knew that you'd been just like me. A placeholder. Someone who was there because the person they really wanted couldn't be. He reached for my hand, squeezing it. That's exactly what I was, he said. Stacey never loved me. She never even wanted me. She just wanted to be married. To have someone who'd provide for her. Someone who'd look the other way while she did whatever she wanted. Was it always like that? From the beginning. Our wedding night, she refused to let me touch her. She told me that if I tried anything, she'd tell everyone I'd forced her. So I backed off. I spent years sleeping in a separate room, trying not to want her, trying not to need her. He let out a breath. There were times when I begged. When I pleaded. I was so desperate for any kind of affection. She'd make promises, and then she'd break them. She'd humiliate me in front of other people, and I'd just take it because I thought maybe if I was good enough, she'd change. Ethan. I know. I was an idiot. I wasted my whole life on someone who never cared about me. I died alone, and my wife was somewhere else, probably with your husband. We're both idiots, I said. He laughed. It was a soft, sad sound. We really are, he said. But not anymore. This time, we're not going to be used. We're going to live. I'm tired of trying, he said. I'm tired of fighting. I just want peace. I offered. Peace, he agreed. And you? I leaned forward and kissed him. It wasn't like the kisses we'd shared before, those had been careful, tentative. This was different. This was everything we'd been holding back for so long. When we pulled apart, we were both breathing hard. Promise me something, I said. Anything. Promise me that no matter what happens, we'll always be honest with each other. No secrets. No lies. If you're hurting, I want to know. If you're scared, I want to know. If you need something, I want to give it to you. I promise, he said. And you? I promise, too. We sat together on the couch, his arm around my shoulders, my head resting against his chest. Stacey is going to come back, he said. She's not going to give up that easily. I know. What are we going to do? I thought about it. Let her come, I said. Let her try. We'll be ready. And Howard? Howard is weak. He'll do whatever Stacey tells him. That's always been his problem. You think she'll try something? She already has. She's been trying to get close to you for years. The only reason she hasn't succeeded is because you've been avoiding her. I have, he said. I've been avoiding her for months. I know. I've noticed. He smiled. You're not jealous. Jealous? Of Stacey? I laughed. No, I'm not jealous. I'm just tired of her. We didn't talk about the past anymore that night. We just held each other, letting the silence settle around us like a blanket. There were so many things we could have said, so many things we still needed to say, but we didn't need to say them all at once. We had time. We had each other. That was enough. The next few weeks were quiet. Howard didn't come back. Stacey didn't show up. It felt like they'd finally given up, like they'd realized that their attempts to sabotage our lives were useless. I was still studying, still working, still building the life I'd always wanted. My career was going well. I was good at what I did, and people were starting to notice. Ethan was busy with his classes, but he still made time for me. He made time for us. We didn't let the past define us. We let it go. But I knew they'd be back. I knew that Howard and Stacey weren't done with us yet. They'd been plotting together for so long that they didn't know how to stop. They'd spent their whole lives taking what they wanted, using people like tools and throwing them away when they were no longer useful. They weren't going to give up that easily. And I was ready for them. I had a second chance, and I wasn't going to waste it. I was going to be happy. I was going to be strong. I was going to be everything they'd tried to keep me from being. Together with Ethan, I was going to win. And they were never going to touch us again. Stacey didn't give up. I'd known she wouldn't. She'd spent her whole life getting what she wanted by any means necessary, and she wasn't going to stop just because I'd told her no. I just didn't expect her to try so hard. A few weeks after Howard's visit, Stacey showed up at my office. I was working late, catching up on a project that was due at the end of the week. The office was quiet, most of my colleagues already gone for the day. The only sounds were the hum of the fluorescent lights and the click of my keyboard. I heard footsteps in the hallway. I looked up, and there she was. Standing in my doorway, wearing a pale pink sweater and a carefully apologetic expression. "Renee," she said, her voice soft. "I hope I'm not interrupting." I leaned back in my chair. "You are. But you're here anyway, so go ahead." She walked into my office and sat down in the chair across from my desk. She looked smaller than I remembered. Diminished. Her shoulders were hunched, her eyes downcast. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," she began. "About everything I did to you. And I realized, you were right. About everything. I was a terrible friend. A terrible person. I hurt you in ways I can't even begin to apologize for." I stayed silent. "I know you don't have any reason to trust me," she continued. "I know I've given you plenty of reasons not to. But I'm trying to change. I really am." "I'm glad," I said. "I hope you do." She looked up at me, her eyes shining with what might have been tears. "Can we try again? Can we be friends again? Just friends. I don't need anything from you. I just want to make things right." I looked at her for a long moment. I'd seen this act before. The remorseful apology. The tears. The promises to change. She'd done it so many times in my past life, and I'd fallen for it every single time. But this time, I knew better. "I'm not sure that's a good idea, Stacey. Please. Just give me one chance. One chance to prove I've changed." I hesitated. Not because I believed her, I didn't, but because I wanted to see where this was going. I wanted to know what she was planning. "Fine," I said. "We can try. But it's going to take time." "I understand," she said. "I know I don't deserve your trust. But I'll earn it. I promise." She left with a smile on her face, a smile I recognized. It was the same smile she'd worn when she gave me that tea all those years ago. I knew she was up to something. I just didn't know what. Stacey started coming around more often. At first, it was just small things. She'd drop by my office with coffee. She'd text me to check in. She'd invite me to lunch, and I'd accept, carefully, cautiously, always watching. I let her think she was winning me over. I acted like I was softening. I even let her talk me into going shopping with her. Just the two of us. She played the part of the reformed friend beautifully. And I played the part of the forgiving one. Underneath all of it, I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. It happened on a Friday night. Ethan and I were hosting a small dinner party at our house. Just a few friends from work and school. It was supposed to be a casual, low-key gathering, good food, good wine, good conversation. Stacey arrived early, carrying a bottle of wine and a covered dish. "I made my famous lasagna," she said, holding it up. "I hope you don't mind." "Of course not," I said, taking the dish from her. "Come in. Make yourself at home." She smiled, and I saw it again, that flash of satisfaction in her eyes. Like she was about to get exactly what she'd been after. The evening was pleasant enough. Ethan was charming, the other guests were interesting, and the food was good. Stacey stayed close to me the entire night, refilling my wine glass whenever it got low, making sure I was comfortable. "Renee, I'm so glad we're doing this," she said. "I've missed this. I've missed you." "Me too," I lied. I wasn't drinking the wine she was pouring. I'd noticed her movements, the way she kept my glass separate from the others, the way she made sure I was always the one drinking from it. I'd poured myself a glass from a different bottle when she wasn't looking, and I'd been subtly switching them out all night. When she offered me another refill, I pretended to drink it. She watched me take a sip, and I saw her smile widen just a little. She thought it was working. Ethan had been watching her all night, too. He caught my eye from across the room, and I gave him a small nod. He knew something was coming. He'd seen the way Stacey had been hovering over me, the way she'd been directing the flow of the evening. He'd also seen me not drinking. When Stacey excused herself to use the bathroom, Ethan slipped over to me. "She's up to something," he whispered. "I know." "What are you going to do?" I smiled. "Let her do it. Then watch what happens." I'd already called ahead, warned the local hospital that I might be bringing someone in. I'd told them about the symptoms I was expecting, the nausea, the cramping, the bleeding. And I'd told them to be ready to test for specific substances. Stacey thought she was poisoning me. She was about to find out what happened when the poison was meant for someone who wasn't there. It happened an hour later. Stacey excused herself again, and I saw her slip something into a glass of wine on the kitchen counter. I watched her from the hallway, my heart pounding. She was doing it. She was actually doing it. A few minutes later, she came back with a glass of wine and handed it to me. "Here," she said. "You barely touched your last one. Try this, it's a new vintage Ethan picked up. I think you'll love it." I took the glass. I brought it to my lips, and I pretended to drink. But I didn't swallow. I let it sit in my mouth while she watched, her eyes bright with anticipation. "Good?" she asked. "Delicious," I said. "Thank you." She smiled, and she went back to her seat, satisfied. I'd been careful to mark the glass she'd handed me. I kept it in my hand, making sure no one else would accidentally drink from it. A few minutes later, I slipped away to the kitchen and poured the contents into a small bottle I'd prepared earlier. I sealed it, labeled it, and put it in my pocket. Evidence. I had evidence. The next day, I took the bottle to the police. I told them I suspected I'd been poisoned. I told them about the history, about the miscarriage, about everything Stacey had done in the past. They tested the wine. The results came back positive for a powerful abortifacient, the same substance Stacey had given me all those years ago. The same substance that had caused my miscarriage. The same substance that had left me infertile. They arrested her 2 days later. She didn't even know what was happening when they showed up at her house. She was still in her bathrobe, her hair wet, her face pale with confusion. "You're making a mistake," she kept saying. "I didn't do anything. I didn't do anything." But the evidence was clear. And the police had recorded her call to me, the one where she'd admitted to poisoning me in the past. The one where she'd said she wanted to make things right. She'd been sloppy. She'd been desperate. And she'd been caught. The trial was brief. Stacey's defense attorney tried to argue that she'd been under a great deal of stress, that she'd been struggling with infertility, that she'd been driven to do something she regretted. But the evidence was overwhelming. She was convicted of attempted murder and sentenced to 8 years in prison. Howard stood by her through the whole thing. He looked pale and thin, his eyes hollow. He'd aged 10 years in the past few months. "I'll wait for you," he told her when they led her away. "I'll be here when you get out." She didn't even look at him. I heard that a few months later, he'd filed for divorce. He'd found someone else, a young woman from his office, someone who didn't know his history. Someone who was naive enough to think he was a good man. I felt sorry for her. But I also felt sorry for myself, for the years I'd wasted on him. And I promised myself I'd never make that mistake again. I went back to my life. Ethan was waiting for me, as he always was. We'd been through so much together, and we'd come out the other side stronger. "Stacey's gone," I said. "She's not coming back." "I know. She tried to kill me." "I know. And I'm still standing." He pulled me into his arms. "You're still standing," he agreed. "And you always will be." We'd been through so much together. The betrayal, the hurt, the lies. But we'd survived. We'd thrived. And now, finally, we could put it all behind us. That night, we sat in our living room, the fireplace crackling, the street lights filtering through the curtains. I thought about what you said, I told him. About living like every day is your last. And I think you're right. I think we should make the most of every moment. He smiled. What did you have in mind? Everything, I said. Travel. Adventure. New experiences. I want to see the world with you. I want to do all the things we never got to do. Then we'll do them. We'll start planning tomorrow. 15 years passed. 15 years of building, growing, healing, thriving. Ethan and I had built something real, not just a marriage, but a partnership. A life that was truly ours. We stayed in the city for a few years after Stacey's conviction. I finished my degree and climbed the corporate ladder at the tech company where I'd started as an intern. Ethan became a full professor with tenure, respected in his field, mentoring students who would go on to do remarkable things. But we'd always talked about leaving. About finding somewhere quieter. Somewhere we could breathe. We bought a small house in the countryside, surrounded by trees and fields. We renovated it ourselves, slowly, room by room. We planted a garden. We got a dog. We hosted dinner parties for friends who drove out from the city on weekends. It was peaceful. It was everything we'd ever wanted. We never had children. The damage Stacey had done to my body was permanent, and by the time we'd thought about adoption, we realized we were content with our lives as they were. We had each other. We had our work. We had our friends. We had more than enough. Some people are meant to be parents, Ethan said one evening, watching me chase the dog around the yard. And some people are meant to be something else. We're something else. What are we? I asked. He smiled. We're survivors. The years passed gently, like water flowing over smooth stones. Ethan published his first book, a collection of essays on technology and society. It was well received, and it opened doors for him. He traveled to conferences in other countries, and I went with him. We saw Paris, Tokyo, Buenos Aires, Prague. We ate strange food and took terrible photos and got lost in foreign cities. I started my own small consulting business, helping companies navigate the rapidly changing landscape of technology. It was flexible and rewarding, and it gave me the freedom to spend time on the things I loved. We were happy. Genuinely, deeply, profoundly happy. I still thought about my past life sometimes. I thought about Howard and the years I'd wasted on him. I thought about Stacey and the poison she'd poured into my life. I thought about the miscarriage, the cancer, the hospital bed, the way I'd died convinced I was loved. But those memories didn't hurt the way they used to. They were distant now, like photographs of someone else's life. Someone I used to know. I'd healed. Not completely. I don't think I'd ever be completely healed, but enough. Enough to let go. Enough to move forward. I ran into Stacey again, 15 years later. It was a rainy afternoon in the city. I was there for a business meeting, and I'd stopped at a small cafe to wait out the downpour. The place was crowded, but I found a table by the window and settled in with a book. I looked up to order, and I saw her. She was standing at the counter, waiting for her coffee. She looked older now, her hair streaked with grey, her face lined with years of unhappiness. She was wearing a cheap coat and worn shoes. She looked tired. She looked small. I recognized her immediately. She didn't recognize me at first. Not until I stood up to leave, and she glanced over and our eyes met. I saw the recognition flash across her face. The shock. The embarrassment. The shame. "Renee," she said. Her voice was hoarse, like she'd been crying. "Stacey." She took a step toward me, then stopped. I didn't know you were in town. "I'm just passing through." "I see." She looked at the floor. "You look well." "I am." I saw her take a breath, saw her shoulders shift like she was about to say something important. But she didn't. She just stood there, staring at her worn shoes, looking like a woman who had run out of words. "I should go," I said. "My train leaves in an hour." "Of course. I didn't mean to, I'm sorry. I know it doesn't mean anything." I know you don't need to hear it. But I'm sorry. I heard you, I said. Goodbye, Stacey. I walked out of the cafe into the rain. I didn't feel anything. Not anger, not sadness, not satisfaction. She was just someone I used to know. A ghost from a life I'd left behind. I got to the train station and found my seat. I leaned my head against the window and watched the city slide past. I thought about Stacey. About the way she'd looked, hollow and broken. About the way she'd tried to apologize, knowing it would never be enough. I didn't forgive her. I didn't need to. Forgiveness wasn't something she deserved. But I also didn't hate her. Hate was too heavy. It took too much effort. And I'd spent too many years carrying that weight to want to carry it anymore. I let it go. I let all of it go. I found out what happened to Stacey and Howard through old friends who still lived in the area. After Stacey's release from prison, she'd tried to start over. She'd moved to a different city. She'd gotten a job at a retail store. She'd started seeing a therapist. But the damage was too deep. The people she'd hurt, the people she'd betrayed, they weren't the only ones who'd been affected. She'd alienated her family, her friends, everyone who'd ever cared about her. She was alone now. Completely alone. Howard had remarried and divorced again. He'd lost his job, then another job, then another. He'd gotten into debt. He'd gotten into trouble. He was living in a small apartment in a bad part of town, barely scraping by. They'd both ended up exactly where they deserved to be, alone, unhappy, forgotten. I didn't feel sorry for them. I felt sorry for the people they'd hurt, for me, for Ethan, for everyone who'd been caught in the crossfire of their selfishness. But I didn't feel sorry for them. They'd made their choices. Now they were living with the consequences. I went home that evening to find Ethan in the garden, pulling weeds. He looked up when he heard my footsteps, and he smiled, that soft, warm smile that had been the best thing in my life for almost 2 decades. Get everything done? He asked. Yes. And I ran into someone. He raised an eyebrow. Someone I know. Stacey. He went still. What happened? Nothing. We talked for a minute. She said she was sorry. I said goodbye. Are you okay? I thought about it. Yes. I think I am. He stood up, brushing the dirt off his knees. He walked over to me and pulled me into a hug. I'm proud of you, he said. What for? For letting it go. For not letting her drag you back into the past. I hugged him back. I had help. We went inside and made dinner together, a simple meal, the kind we'd made 100 times before. I chopped vegetables. He stirred the sauce. The dog lay at our feet, waiting for scraps to fall. Ethan, I said. Thank you. For everything. He looked at me, a question in his eyes. For seeing me, I said. For choosing me. For not giving up on me when I was a mess. He put down the spoon and crossed the kitchen to where I stood. He cupped my face in his hands and looked at me, really looked at me. Renee, he said, I wasn't choosing you. I was choosing us. There's a difference. What's the difference? I wasn't looking for a wife. I was looking for a partner. Someone who would be there for me, no matter what. Someone who would fight for me the way I would fight for them. And I found you. We ate dinner on the back porch, watching the sun go down. I used to think about dying, I said. All the time. It was always there, in the back of my mind. The cancer. The hospital. The way I went out. And now. Now I think about living. Every day. Every moment. I think about how lucky I am to be here. To have you. To have this. I know what you mean, he said. I used to think about it, too. The stomach cancer. The way it ate me from the inside out. The way I was alone when I died. But you're not alone now. No, I'm not. He reached across the table and took my hand. I spent my whole first life waiting for someone to love me, he said. I settled for crumbs. I let myself be used because I was too scared to be alone. And I spent my whole first life thinking I was loved, I said. I let myself believe the lies because I was too scared to see the truth. But we're not scared anymore. No, I said. We're not. We stayed on the porch until the stars came out. I looked up at the sky, the same sky I'd looked at 20 years ago, when I'd died, when I'd been reborn, when everything had changed. The stars were the same. But I was different. I'd survived. I'd thrived. I'd built a life out of nothing, and I'd filled it with love and joy and purpose. I'd found someone who saw me, not the woman I'd been, not the woman I was pretending to be, but the real me. The one who'd been hiding all along. And I'd let go of the past. The anger. The hurt. The fear. I'd let it all go. Ethan stood up and held out his hand. Ready to go inside? He asked. I took his hand and stood up. Ready, I said. We walked inside, closing the door on the night. This is the end of the story. Or maybe it's just the beginning. It doesn't matter, really. What matters is that I'm here. I'm alive. I'm loved. And I'm happy. More than happy. I'm whole. We stayed together for all the years that followed. We grew old, side by side, the way we'd promised each other we would. We watched each other's hair turn grey. We held each other when we were sick. We celebrated each other's successes and grieved each other's losses. And when the end came, years and years later, after a long, full, beautiful life, it came peacefully, quietly, without pain. I closed my eyes for the last time, and I thought about everything I'd done, everything I'd become, everything I'd been given. And I smiled. Because this time, I didn't die alone. This time, I died loved. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.